Bueno, buenas tardes, Arratsaldeon, good afternoon. Bueno, iniciamos hoy un ciclo de conferencias dentro del Laboratorio Permanente de Innovación Social. El Laboratorio Permanente de Innovación Social es una iniciativa que surgió del Departamento de Derechos Sociales, en concreto del Observatorio de la Realidad Social de Navarra, que en primera instancia estuvieron en este laboratorio el Instituto y Comunitas de la Universidad Pública de Navarra, también el Instituto de Cultura y Sociedad de la Universidad de Navarra, y luego posteriormente nos adherimos la Fundación La Caixa, el Colegio de Sociólogos y Politólogos de Navarra y Fundación Caja Navarra. Yo, de hecho, soy Javier Fernández, su director. El objeto de este laboratorio permanente es estar atento o investigar los nuevos retos a los que se enfrenta la sociedad, buscar la colaboración y el trabajo en red y buscar esos retos que pueden ser comunes y también de alguna manera poder pilotar algunas experiencias de cómo afrontarlos. Bueno, como os decía, este convenio arranca con este ciclo de charlas. El ciclo lo hemos titulado Desafíos sociales del presente. Vamos a tener 3. Empiezo por la última. El 18 de abril tendremos a José Casanova, que hablará sobre Quo Vadimus, choque entre civilizaciones, guerras culturales y desafíos globales. El 23 de marzo, Augusto López Claros hablará sobre las reformas de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, guerra, paz y lecciones de historia. Y hoy contamos con Vander Weele, profesor de la Universidad de Harvard, catedrático de epidemiología y director de Human Flourishing Program de la Universidad de Harvard. Moderará esta charla Javier García Manglado, investigador del Instituto de Cultura y Sociedad, que lo tengo aquí a la izquierda. So welcome, Vander Weele. It's a pleasure for us to have here, and we're looking forward to listening to you. And so, the stage and the microphone is yours.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to speak to you all and for me to visit Pamplona as well. I have very much enjoyed the stay, and you have a very beautiful city indeed. I will be speaking today on flourishing and issues ranging from kind of self-care to community engagement, and essentially order of presentation today will be as follows. I'll make some remarks on the concept of flourishing. What is it? How do we try to understand it? And then I'll talk briefly about some of our attempts to assess flourishing and why this is important, why this is useful to communities, to societies, I think potentially to nations even. After that, I will shift focus and talk about how do we enhance flourishing, how do we enhance well-being. And I'll begin with individual activities each person can do that we know from the scientific evidence enhance well-being, but then I'll move on to the importance of community engagement as well. More information on the Human Flourishing program at Harvard is available on our website, and also there are a couple of papers summarizing some of the work that I'll be describing. While these are published in academic journals, they're really intended to be quite accessible to any general reader. So if we look to our institutions, our often discussions about what we're seeking as individuals, or even our academic disciplines, we often see that these aspire to grand visions of human flourishing. The World Health Organization's definition of health from 1948, still the same definition that they're using today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The discipline of economics is sometimes described as the study of how individuals go about maximizing their utility, supposedly taking into account all aspects of the agent's preferences, everything that we care about. The discipline of positive psychology is sometimes described as the scientific study of the strengths, that enable individuals and communities to thrive. But many of our policy objectives, many of our discussions, many of our academic studies are focused on much narrower outcomes, maybe a specific disease state, or simply assessing whether we feel happy at a given moment, or just looking at income rather than all aspects of something that someone cares about. So what is flourishing? Since much of what we do seems to miss this grand vision. What is flourishing? And I understand that the translation of this word into Spanish is a little bit more complex. From what I've learned over the last 2 days, I do think kind of well-being or complete human well-being is another way to try to describe this concept. But if we turn in English to our dictionaries, we get sort of the following definitions. From the Oxford English Dictionary, to flourish is to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way. From the American Heritage Dictionary, to do or fare well. The etymology of the term, shared, I believe, with Spanish is from Latin, florere, to bloom, blossom, flower. It's often the word used to translate what Aristotle called eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. The definition that we've been using at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard is that flourishing or complete human well-being is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. So kind of all-encompassing. And really an ideal. We never fully attain this. There's always something that's not quite right, but it's sort of the ideal that we're seeking, arguably seeking as individuals, and really should be pursuing, I think, as a society. In the academic literature, I think that the discipline that has tried to come closest to describing this notion of flourishing is that of positive psychology, which has, I think, entered into popular discourse as well over the last couple of decades. And there are many measures and conceptualizations of well-being in this literature, and I think much of it is good and helpful. But missing from many of these descriptions of well-being is any notion of physical health. And are we really fully flourishing if we're severely ill or bedridden? Often missing from some of these assessments and conceptualizations of well-being is any notion of character. Contrary to Plato or Aristotle, most of the Western philosophical tradition and really philosophical, religious, cultural traditions worldwide. But with a conception so broad as human flourishing, we might ask, can we ever really measure this or assess it? Can we ever achieve any sort of consensus? I mean, surely this is going to vary across countries and religions and cultures and philosophies. How do we ever come to any agreement? And while I do think it's the case that understandings of flourishing are going to vary, at least somewhat, by culture and by tradition, I do think there are also common elements across these different understandings of flourishing, across cultures, across traditions. And so what I would argue is that whatever else flourishing may consist of, it would include the following 5 domains of human life as well. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5, but I think any reasonable conception of flourishing would include these 5 domains of human life. And these are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, trying to be a good person, and close social relationships. Again, the argument's not that this exhausts flourishing, that this is everything that flourishing is, but just whatever else might be included in understanding of flourishing, I think these 5 aspects of human life would also be included. I think each of these domains also has the following 2 properties. Each is nearly universally desired. Almost everyone wants these things as a part of their life, and I think this is the case across cultures and traditions. And each is an end in and of itself. It's sought for its own sake. It's not simply a means to some other end. And I think those two criteria of being nearly universally desired and being an end might help shape consensus around what to measure and what to aim for in society, even a potentially more pluralistic society. So, as a very brief assessment of flourishing, sort of a crude assessment, we've taken two questions in each of these 5 domains, drawn principally from the existing well-being literature, and questions that are already widely used for the most part, to build a brief flourishing index that we can use in the workplace settings, in schools, at universities, in medicine, within communities, national assessment, to try to understand kind of what's going well, what's not going well, how are things changing over time, what needs work and improvement. And I'll describe some of these efforts in greater detail later, but by doing this, we can decide where to focus, either as individuals or as communities. So I'm briefly going to run through these 10 questions that we've been using in our measurement work, and then I'll talk more about potential uses of this type of data. So our first domain is happiness and life satisfaction, and one of the questions we use on life satisfaction is, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? Self-rated from 0 to 10 on a scale, so 0, not at all satisfied, 10, completely satisfied. And this is one of the most widely used questions in the well-being literature. It's used by the OECD. It's been used in the UK's annual survey. It's been used by Gallup. It's been used in many studies. And then we supplement that with something more oriented towards how one feels. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? Scored again from 0, extremely unhappy, to 10, extremely happy. Our second domain is physical and mental health, and these are general, widely used self-report health questions by this General Social Survey and by the World Health Organization. How would you rate your overall physical health, 0 to 10? And how would you rate your overall mental health, 0 to 10? Our third domain is meaning and purpose. One question on worthwhile activities overall. To what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? 0, not at all worthwhile. 10, completely worthwhile. And this question is likewise widely used by the OECD and the UK's annual survey, many cohort studies. And then we supplement that with something more cognitive about understanding. I understand my purpose in life. Scored 0, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree. Our fourth domain, character strengths. First, I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. 0, completely untrue of me, 10, completely true of me. And then a second one, I'm always able to give up some happiness now for a greater happiness later. Again, 0 to 10, completely untrue of me to completely true of me. And then our last domain, close social relationships. These two questions were taken from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness survey of short assessments for social connectedness. The first question, I am content with my friendships and relationships. 0, completely untrue of me, 10, completely agree. And this is kind of trying to get at the quantity of those relationships. And then the second question, my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be. 0, completely disagree, 10, completely agree. This question sort of trying to get at the quality of those relationships. So in much of our reporting, we'll look at these 5 domains separately because, as I'll show shortly, the dynamics can be quite different across the various domains, but sometimes we'll just take an average of all 10 questions for a crude, brief assessment of overall flourishing, but this is really nothing more than the average of those 5 more meaningful domains. We do typically also supplement those 10 questions with 2 others on financial and material stability as really important critical means to sustain those other ends. And so these questions, drawn from the financial well-being literature, are: how often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? 0, worry all the time. 10, do not worry at all. And then second, how often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? And so we'll often look at this 6th domain as well. So we've, as I'll describe shortly, we've used this in a number of workplace and medical and educational and community settings, but I think the questions are also quite helpful for personal reflection, to think about one's own life, to think about what's going well and what's not going so well, to perhaps try to identify areas in which one wants to seek improvement or changes that one wants to make in life. To track over time what's improving and what's staying the same and what's getting worse potentially. I try to go through these questions myself at least once a quarter to better understand and reflect upon my life. When we've done this in various workplace and educational settings, some of the feedback we've had has been as follows. Some questions made me stop and think. It was pretty eye-opening to see the areas that I really need to work on. Relief that someone is asking, I want help in certain areas. Slightly caught off guard with the questions around purpose. Missing a greater purpose, need to reach out more and give back. One participant in these assessments said after going through it, she realized she really wanted to commit to a volunteer activity after considering it for some prior months. So again, I think there are benefits of simply going through and thinking about one's own life. So I am actually going to take roughly a 2-minute pause and ask you to think about your own life, to go through these 10 questions. I will slowly repeat each one, and we'll have the translation, obviously, and I'll give a brief pause, and we won't be collecting data on this here, but again, it provides an opportunity to just think about, reflect on one's own life. So again, first, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? In general, how would you rate your physical health? How would you rate your overall mental health? Overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? I understand my purpose in life. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. always able to give up some happiness now for greater happiness later. I am content with my friendships and relationships. My relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be. So I realize 2 minutes is not a lot of time, probably no major life changes in that span of time, but hopefully kind of a helpful exercise and self-reflection, and that may prompt further reflection subsequently. And I think at a community level, simply describing what is going on can help identify what's going well, what's not going well, how are things changing over time, what needs to be addressed. So I'll be presenting here data from the United States that's roughly nationally representative of the country on what the self-report assessments were immediately prior to the World Health Organization's declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic back in January of 2020, and then about 6 months later in the midst of the pandemic in June of 2020. And if one looks in January of 2020, before the pandemic, the average in the United States across the various domains was about 7 points out of 10. The one exception was financial and material stability, which was only about 6. During the pandemic, unsurprisingly, well-being went down on average, but interestingly, it affected these domains in different ways. Happiness went down quite a bit, 0.7 of a point, big fall, again, perhaps not too surprising. Mental and physical health likewise went down quite a lot. Again, not too surprising. Financial and material stability had a big fall, and June of 2020 was the height of unemployment in the United States during the pandemic. But interestingly, some of the other domains didn't change as much. Meaning and purpose went down a little, but not as much. The character assessments were pretty much level. And somewhat surprisingly, the close social relationships assessment went down a little bit, but only 0.2 of a point. And we were quite surprised by this when we first saw it. But this has been corroborated by other studies as well. And while there were unquestionably social and community restrictions during this time, it seems like it was also a time for some people, at least, to more deeply invest in their family or those they were living with, or with relatives who were perhaps far off via phone or Zoom technologies. There was evidence that children felt closer to their fathers during the pandemic. Importantly, however, the variability in each of these domains also went up during the pandemic. It wasn't just that the means changed, but how the distribution itself, it was much more spread out during the pandemic. And so those changes on average disguise very differing experiences. While for some people the pandemic may have been a time of deeper investment at home, for others, perhaps especially those living alone, this might have been an especially difficult time. And so I think it's important to look not just at what's happening on average, but also the distribution or sort of equality of flourishing as well. We've continued to collect this sort of data relatively routinely, And by January of 2022, the flourishing scores in the United States had returned roughly to the levels they were in January of 2020. But once again, the distribution had really shifted. It shifted especially with age. Traditionally, when one looks at well-being and age, in many countries and many settings, that curve had been sort of U-shaped, with younger people and older people doing somewhat better, and those in midlife, those perhaps struggling with young children and aging parents and with career challenges, typically had lower levels of well-being. Over time, and this began in fact prior to the pandemic, but was accelerated by it, that left part of the U for young people began flattening. And in January of 2022, for the first time, we saw each of these flourishing dimensions increasing in age. Young people were not doing as well as they used to be. And so again, I think the simple description of what's going on can help understand what might be taking place at a societal level. So we've been trying to collect this sort of data in a variety of workplace settings, employees at the World Bank and at Aetna, and factory workers in Mexico, Poland, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and China with international flight attendants, and in various settings within medicine, within universities, within secondary schools, within communities, within research studies, both to understand how is flourishing distributed, who's doing well, who's not, who needs help, how can we help, but also to look at what is causing flourishing and how might we improve flourishing, and that's the topic I'll be turning to the second part of the talk. But simply descriptively, some of what we've observed in various settings is that financial and material stability domain is often rated the lowest. Not everywhere. That was not the case with our employees at Aetna, for example. That wasn't the case in the sample we have in Denmark. But in many settings, the financial and material stability is a real challenge. Having the means to pursue, to sustain flourishing is critical and needs to be addressed. One rather humbling result for my own country, the United States, as we've generally found our social connectedness scores in the United States to be much lower than just about any other country or any other setting. So I think that's something that we need to work on as a country. We've seen, at least in the West, that as I described before, many of these dimensions now are increasing with age, and fairly soon we'll have more global data, and we'll see where these patterns continue to play out, or whether there is quite a bit of difference across various geographical regions. But one of those differences across geographical regions and with respect to development concerns the difference between happiness and purpose. We find, perhaps unsurprisingly, that happiness and life satisfaction tend to be higher in richer, developed countries than poorer, developing countries. But with meaning and purpose, we actually find the opposite. That meaning and purpose tends to be higher in poorer, developing countries than richer, developed countries. And so I think this raises important questions with regard to how do we carry out economic development in a way that doesn't compromise meaning and purpose? Are we focused too much sometimes on GDP to the neglect of those things in life that are more central to our humanity? So this is kind of some of what I think one can learn descriptively. And to try to do this in a more global setting, we've launched with Gallup a major global flourishing study. This study will involve about 200,000 individuals in 22 countries, representing about half the world's population. We'll have nationally representative sampling in each country, and we're going to follow the same group of 200,000 individuals once a year for 5 years to see how flourishing is distributed, but also to try to work out over time what helps flourishing increase and what might be an impediment to flourishing that has flourishing decrease. And so we're about halfway through the first wave of data collection in the study, but we really hope it's a valuable resource to understand flourishing better. With that, I do want to transition now to not just sort of what is flourishing and how do we measure it, but how do we improve it? How do we improve it as individuals? How might we improve it as a society? And one interesting source to turn to is the various activities that have come out of the positive psychology literature. Psychologists focus on the more positive aspects of human life and human experience, have for a number of years been thinking about this question: how do we increase human well-being? And lots of different possibilities have been attempted, but as the science on this topic has progressed, certain activities have emerged as very clearly helpful. Others haven't worked and have been set aside. But the designs, the studies that have been used to do this assessment have used very rigorous standards. They've used randomized trials, the same sorts of studies that are used to assess cancer treatments or that are used to assess the efficacy of vaccines have been used to study activities that might enhance well-being. So I'll go through some of these, like gratitude and acts of kindness and imagining one's best possible self and potential for forgiveness activities also. If you're interested in learning more, we have a little guide to activities for flourishing, kind of based on the evidence. We also have a flourishing app on our website that's free and downloadable that implements some of these, but I'll describe some of these activities in a bit greater detail. So perhaps one of the best studied of these activities are gratitude exercises, kind of simply affirming that something good has happened and that probably someone else was largely responsible for that good thing in one's life. And there have been at least 40 or 50 randomized trials looking at these gratitude activities. It's pretty well established now. Some examples are sort of 3 times a week, write down 3 things you're grateful for and why. And maybe do this for 6 weeks. And the studies have suggested that simple practice of gratitude 3 times a week increases happiness, decreases depressive symptoms even 6 months later, improves sleep, decreases self-reported health symptoms. So effects on outcomes most people care about. We try to practice this in my own family around the dinner table. We'll go through and express 3 things that each of us are grateful for, and I really do think it's very helpful on the weeks that we somehow forget or the practice slips. I feel I really notice the difference in our family dynamics. An alternative approach is kind of somewhat more involved and more of a one-off activity is write a letter to someone to whom you're grateful and who has not been properly thanked, and then send that letter to the person. This sort of activity, likewise, has positive effects on well-being. They tend to be stronger effects initially, but fade a little bit more quickly than those more regular gratitude exercises. But there's nothing to prevent one from potentially engaging in both types of activities. So again, this is one of the most rigorously studied of these positive psychology interventions. Another sort of activity that has been pretty well studied is carrying out acts of kindness that you might not otherwise do. And variations on this have likewise been studied, but one of the most effective forms is as follows. For 6 weeks, choose 1 day each week and carry out 5 acts of kindness that you wouldn't otherwise do. And it takes quite a bit of planning to get 5 all in a single day. But because of that planning and that mental focus, and then actually carrying out the acts, the evidence again from randomized trials suggests that this sort of activity has effects on happiness, has effects on one's sense of engagement with life. It results in less anxiety, makes one feel more connected with others. There's also evidence, again, from rigorous randomized studies that when you act kindly towards someone else, they're more likely to go on to act kindly towards the next person that they meet. And so that kindness sort of is able to spread through society, spread through a social network. One study suggested that an act of kindness between two people initially can affect 3 subsequent interactions. So it might affect the interactions of 2 people later on who don't even know the original pair who had been interacting. So these acts of kindness can propagate in addition to positively affecting one's own well-being. A third possible activity that's been examined in these randomized trials is sort of imagining one's best possible self. This is a more intensive activity. You maybe only do this once every year, every few years even. But the instructions are often something along the lines as follows. Think about your life in the future. Imagine that everything has gone as well as it possibly could. You have worked hard and succeeded at accomplishing all of your life goals. Think of this as the realization of all your dreams. Now write about what you have imagined. Reflect then on this best possible life with respect to family, romantic partner, friends, career, health, hobbies, goals, one's character, and then further write about kind of goals, plans, or actions that might help achieve this life of the best possible self that was envisioned. And again, evidence from randomized trials comparing those who were randomized to participate in this activity versus some neutral activity suggests effects on happiness and life satisfaction, an increased optimism, and an increased sense of flow in life. So all of these are things that can pretty easily be done on one's own. Yet another activity is to sort of identify your central character strengths, and there are different online assessments to do this, and then use each one in a new way once a week for several weeks. And again, randomized trials indicating that doing this increases happiness, results in fewer depressive symptoms as well. And then the final one, I'll mention one that we've been actively studying at present, is forgiveness. The experience of being wronged and being angry about that is very common. And it can often be very difficult to get rid of those feelings of anger, even when one wants to. So forgiveness is essentially replacing ill will towards the offender, wanting something really bad to happen to them, with goodwill. It's different. Forgiveness is different from forgetting or excusing the action. It's different from reconciling and restoring the relationship. It's different from not demanding justice. One can pursue a just outcome and still hope for the ultimate good of the offender. Forgiveness is simply replacing ill will towards the offender with goodwill. But often that's difficult to bring about in one's life. It's very common to have the experience of thinking one has forgiven, and then 3 days later you're really angry again. And so work in psychology has gone into trying to develop models that help someone who wants to forgive and is having trouble doing so. The model that we've been studying is Everett Worthington's REACH model, where each letter of REACH, R-E-A-C-H, stands for a different part of the process. R, recall the hurt. Don't suppress those feelings. Let them arise. Acknowledge the wrong that was done. And then, somewhat more challenging, empathize with the offender. Try to understand the offender's perspective without condoning the action or without invalidating one's feelings. But try to understand the other person. Then A, altruistic gesture of forgiveness, realizing that forgiveness is something you can offer or not, but also realizing that one has done wrong oneself and that one has sometimes been in need of forgiveness oneself. C, commit to forgive, make that decision to do so. But then H, hold on to the forgiveness, realizing that it's a process, it takes time. Those emotional feelings will come and go. It doesn't mean you're not committed to forgiveness, it just means it will take time. And so we've tried to distill some of these practices into a workbook that only takes 2 or 3 hours to complete. And we've tested this in a large randomized trial of about 4,000 participants in 5 different countries, relatively high conflict areas: Colombia, South Africa, Ukraine, Indonesia, and Hong Kong. And we've found that the practice of forgiveness, this use of these forgiveness workbooks, both increases forgiveness, but also reduces depression symptoms, reduces anxiety symptoms, and increases all of those dimensions of flourishing. So I think this is a powerful approach as well to deal not just with the positive side of life, but with the difficulties, the harms, the wrongs that have been experienced as well. So I think all of these can be quite helpful activities and exercises, could be widely distributed in schools and workplaces and communities. Each of these can be carried out oneself on one's own. However, there are limits to what can be done on one's own. Most of these various interventions have been shown to have effects on happiness and on physical and mental health. But they've been less effective at changing the other aspects of flourishing, of purpose, of character, of relationships. Some of the interventions that have tried to improve purpose have not been successful. Many of those studies haven't even been published because they were unsuccessful. And I think for these other aspects of flourishing, we need other things. We need other people. We need engagement in communities and institutions and longer-term commitments and relationships. And so I want to very briefly move on to this question of community engagement as well. And the way we've tried to think about this is sort of through the lens of public health, but sort of trying to create a public health of well-being, not just physical health. And often the way we think about the forces that shape population health is through a lens of 2 factors. First, what is common in the population? What behaviors or activities or phenomena are very common? And secondly, what has large effects on the outcomes that we care about? Anything that's common and has large effects is going to powerfully shape population health. And so when we apply that lens to physical health, we're led to things like exercise, nutrition, not smoking, getting enough sleep. Each of those is common and has important effects on physical health. But if we ask that same question, what's common and has large effects, not just for physical health, but for all of those aspects of flourishing, for happiness, for mental health, for meaning, for character, for relationships, that list looks rather different. And so based on a review of the academic literature, looking at the most rigorous studies, I would propose 4 pathways, and those 4 are family, work, education, and religious community. There's evidence that globally each of these is relatively common in the population, and each has large effects from very rigorous academic studies across those different flourishing domains. Each is an important contributor to flourishing. Engagement in each of these institutions or communities powerfully affects well-being. The argument's not that these are exhaustive. Other aspects of engagement might be very important for an individual. Maybe for some individuals, engagement in the arts, for example, is extremely important and might have effects on different aspects of well-being, but that deep engagement might be less common worldwide. But it's not an exhaustive list, nor is the argument that these 4 are necessary. One can flourish in the absence of one or more of these pathways to flourishing. Rather, the argument is that each of these communal pathways really does powerfully affect well-being, and that if as individuals we were to engage more deeply, or if as a society we work on to supporting these various pathways, that societal flourishing would increase, population flourishing would increase, individual level flourishing would increase. So this is sort of a brief description of the evidence, a kind of a depiction of the story trying to tell here, where we have the 5 flourishing domains on the right, and those 4 pathways on the left. And these numbers on the arrows are kind of rigorous studies from the academic literature indicating that these effects exist, that they're real, that they're important. And I think this is especially critical because community participation in the West has fallen quite substantially over the past several decades, and that's been exacerbated yet further by the pandemic. But I think participating in these institutions, these communities that extend over time, that have a lifetime, that extend beyond that of a particular individual, that have a shared set of values and interests and purpose, really is important for flourishing. And again, I think amongst these, our family, the workplace, education, religious community. That's, again, not exhaustive. There's, I think, evidence for important effects of volunteering, of political organizations, of arts communities. Again, the extent of participation globally is a little bit less in these, but these are important as well. I think it's important we invest in these, and can sometimes be onerous. I mean, often those communal engagements come with a lot of headaches and difficult people we might not entirely want to deal with, and extra commitments. But the evidence from the empirical literature suggests that over time, working through those difficulties, working through those challenges, does ultimately increase happiness and one's sense of meaning and one's character, one's relationships, even one's health, extending one's longevity even. So I think while individual psychology is important, while I think those activities for well-being should be used and should be widely disseminated, we shouldn't stop there. I think we really do need to support community life. I think we need to support it especially as the pandemic comes to an end. And so I think it's wonderful that there's this community center here. Likewise, supporting community life, I do think it is a critical part of flourishing. So in conclusion, I think flourishing really does pertain to all aspects of life. It's clearly important to us as individuals. Personally, I think in our academic studies we need more of a focus on flourishing, and I think in our policy thinking and decisions we need to focus not just on economic outcomes, which are important unquestionably, but also on these other aspects of flourishing as well. I think we need better support for study of these other outcomes, ranging from government funding to university priorities. We need governments to do a better job of tracking these well-being and flourishing measures. And a lot of change has taken place, in fact, over the last 10 years. The OECD is releasing a report on the extent of this well-being assessment, and although we have a long way to go, it looks much better in terms of how we're tracking and assessing these than it did 10 years ago. But I think similar efforts could be made by employers and workplaces, by medical centers, by schools and universities, by communities, to look at flourishing over time, to identify what's going well, what's not, who needs help, how we might improve it, and how are things changing. I really do think that what we measure and what we assess shapes what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, and the policies that are put in place to achieve it. So I think we should be aiming for flourishing, both as individuals and as a community. Thank you all for being here. That concludes my presentation, and happy to take questions and comments. Yes, can hear you.
Muy bien. Pues muchas gracias, Tyler. Bueno, pues ahora me corresponde a mí ordenar un poco el turno de preguntas. Por supuesto debéis preguntar en español o en inglés si alguien quiere, pero todo se le traduce también a él, así que no hay ningún problema. Y bueno, no sé cómo está representado aquí los diferentes actores, pues desde el mundo académico, igual hay alguno, sé que hay alguno, la sociedad civil, diferentes comunidades, incluso pues de tipo clínico, que también pues tiene mucho que ver con lo que nos ha explicado el profesor Vander Weele. Bueno, pues os animo a hacer preguntas si alguien quiere. Creo que hay micrófonos, eso es, hay un micrófono ahí atrás. Entonces, si levantáis la mano, pues el micrófono. Esto es.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación, ha sido muy interesante. Pienso que en algunas ocasiones lo que usted presenta muchas veces se llama pseudociencia o otro tipo de conocimientos que quizá no tienen una base científica muy probada. Bueno, se ha visto que en los randomized trials pues no, sí que está probada. ¿Piensa que la sociedad debe tener una exposición más grande a este tipo de conocimiento? O, digamos, se me ocurre, por ejemplo, las ciencias médicas o la salud podrían utilizar más este tipo de conocimientos en el flourishing y no tanto tratar directamente enfermedades científicamente y tan, quizá un poco desarraigadas de este tipo de pensamiento.
No, thank you very much, and I do appreciate the comment and the perspective, and I think you're right that some of this has been perceived as a pseudoscience, and I think our understanding, the science of flourishing, really has changed dramatically over the last couple of decades. And while 20 years ago, much of it was pseudoscience. Increasingly, the designs have become more and more rigorous, and so those randomized trials, again, are the highest standard of evidence. And I think anything which we're going to widely disseminate across society or in schools and workplaces needs to be well studied. We don't want to make massive dissemination efforts for something that may not work. Maybe in one setting or another, as sort of to experiment a little bit. But if we're talking about widespread dissemination in society, I do think we want to be grounded in science. And so, when looking at those communal pathways, for example, much of the literature was not very good. They collected data all at once, and it's difficult to tell cause and effect when everything's collected cross-sectionally all at the same time. So as one example, many studies indicate that marriage is associated with happiness. But is that because marriage causes happiness? Or is it because happy people are more likely to go on to get married? Which is it? With data all at once, we can't tell. We need data over time to work out those relationships. There is evidence for both from more rigorous studies, but we need those more rigorous studies. And so in some cases, this required throwing out 90 or even 99% of the studies which were done cross-sectionally. But again, increasingly, we have these more rigorous designs looking over time, how things are changing over time to try to work out cause and effect. So I really do think that the scientific endeavor is important, but I think we have been building a science of flourishing. We have a long way to go, but we've made a lot of progress in the last 2 decades, and I think some of this, at least, is ready to be disseminated to the general public and in all of these different settings.
Thank you.
Buenas tardes. Gracias por su charla sobre la felicidad. Uno de los 4 caminos que se indican que son la manera de alcanzarla dice que es la religión. ¿Se podría contemplar como un camino equiparable a la religión, sin ser religión, el autoconocimiento espiritual o el crecimiento espiritual o otra serie de cosas relacionadas con la persona, pero sin tener que pensar en una religión específica con un Dios. No sé si me explico bien. Digamos, yogas o, en fin, otras cosas que sean crecimiento espiritual, pero que no sea la religión exactamente. Esa es mi pregunta. Gracias.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question and an important question. So, the studies thus far that have looked at different aspects of religion and spirituality and spiritual practice have suggested that it really is religious service attendance that has these powerful effects. Attending once a week versus not at all over 15 years is associated with about 30% reductions in all-cause mortality over those 15 years, about 30% reductions in depression, 5-fold lower suicide rates, 50% lower divorce rates, and this is controlling for all sorts of other factors and variables. When one looks at kind of private spiritual practices, you don't find much association with subsequent health and well-being. That doesn't mean they aren't important in a person's life, just that they don't have as strong of effects on health. There seems to be something really powerful about, once again, the community, the coming together. So with respect to yoga practice, I think yoga practice in a community is going to be more powerful for well-being than yoga practice on one's own. The yoga practice on one's own may still help somewhat, but there's something about that communal involvement that seems to be important. When one looks at other types of community involvement, volunteering organizations or arts organizations, you do still find some effects on well-being. They tend to be somewhat smaller than the effects one finds for religious communities, but still important effects. Again, that communal element really does seem to be critical. So my speculation, and this is speculation now, I don't have the data, the rigorous science on this yet, is that those forms of community life that more resemble a religious community, those forms that maybe have a shared history that extend beyond the life of an individual, that have a common purpose, that have a shared set of values, are going to have stronger effects than the forms of community which just involve meeting together. So, for example, kind of participating in a volunteering organization might have stronger effects on well-being than just showing up weekly for a card game. Even showing up weekly for a card game is valuable and has effects on well-being. But I think the sort of the richer the community life is, the stronger the effects on well-being seem to be. Again, that claim I can't definitively prove yet, but from the evidence I've seen, that's some of what I think is taking place.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias por la charla. Yo quería preguntar, muchas veces había leído que algunos de los dominios que están recogidos en la medida que se ha utilizado de flourishment, ¿no?, de florecimiento, como relaciones sociales próximas o significado y propósito en la vida, etcétera, eran parte de otro de los dominios incluidos en el mismo concepto, que es el de felicidad y satisfacción. O sea, yo siempre había pensado o había leído que tener propósito, tener relaciones sociales próximas y tal, causaban felicidad, ¿no? Y sin embargo, pues están metidos en el mismo concepto. Es un poco una duda un poco así conceptual, sin más. Otra cosita que quería preguntar es de qué modo se controla el efecto de esos ejercicios que ha comentado, actividades que se pueden realizar para mejorar pues el florecimiento, ¿no?, como por ejemplo el ejercicio de acciones amables, la gratitud, etcétera, el efecto que tienen en la satisfacción, si es a través de experimentos o cómo, ¿no? Pues un antes y un después, de qué modo se hace. Y luego, ya una curiosidad final, en la gráfica que mostraba la revisión de la literatura, sobre las flechas había varios números que eran el número de artículos que muestran una relación positiva entre las dos variables, o eran referencias que a lo mejor aparecen en el paper, en fin, esas cosas sin más. Muchas gracias.
Great, thank you. Maybe I'll take those three questions in reverse order. The simpler one at the end first. So, with regard to the figure, each of those numbers corresponded to a reference in the paper of a fairly rigorous study with data over time, or that was randomized. So some of them had several numbers where there was quite a bit of evidence, others maybe only one or two. That review was from 2017, and over the last 5 years, actually, each of those arrows has increased. So if we were to do a new diagram, there would be a lot more numbers, but you can find kind of the individual studies in that 2017 paper. With regard to control, in these studies, like of gratitude exercises. So these were randomized trials where each individual is either randomized to do the gratitude exercises or told to do some neutral activity, like write about any event that happened today. And so for each person, the investigator would flip a coin, and sort of heads, they would be told to do the gratitude exercises, and tails, they would be told to write about a neutral activity. But because that's random, the two groups are going to be very, very comparable on everything except whether they were told to do gratitude or write about a neutral life event. And then one follows them up over a few weeks or a few months to look at the outcome. So that's how the control was done. On the last question with regard to, do all the domains just go into life satisfaction, and should that be considered the ultimate measure of flourishing? I think it is the case that each of those other domains contribute to life satisfaction. If you feel you have meaning and purpose in your life, you're generally going to feel more satisfied. If you're healthy, you're going to feel more satisfied. If you have good relationships, you're going to feel more satisfied. So I think that is the case. They do go in. But that life satisfaction is still not, I think, an adequate overall summary. If you can only ask one question, I think it's a good one to ask, but it doesn't capture everything, nor does it capture human decision making. And you can see this by just looking at human behavior. Some people will give up some happiness and life satisfaction for a feeling that they're called to do some important work to serve those in need. Or someone might give up some degree of life satisfaction for the sake of a relationship, or some life satisfaction because they think they need to do the right thing. And so while life satisfaction, I think, is important to everyone, it's not all that shapes human well-being. And I think sort of the studies that indicate that life satisfaction is higher in richer developed countries, but meaning and purpose is higher in poor developing countries, indicate that there are sometimes these real trade-offs. So while I would say if you can only ask one question, the life satisfaction is a good one, I think we miss these important nuances and understanding what's going well and what's not going well if we don't do more comprehensive assessments.
Well, okay, first of all, thanks, Mr. Tyler, for the presentation. At some point, you said that we could observe differences in the self-reported flourishing among age groups, being the older the age group, the higher the flourishing, and the younger the lower. My question is, are there also some differences in the standard deviations among age groups? And if they are such as difference, what could be the explanation?
That's a good question. I could provide an answer to it, but I'd have to go back and look at the paper that we've published. My guess is that there's somewhat more variability amongst youth and young adults than there is somewhat later in life. There might be quite a bit of variability late life as well, but I'd have to go back and look at the actual data to be able to answer that definitively. And it might vary by domain of flourishing as well. So if you want to follow up with me by email, I'm happy to try to answer that. I'm sorry I can't recall that at present.
I would like to ask about this youth and exactly about the psychological epidemics, for example, about suicide or gender dysphoria, and how this affects, for example, that outcome in satisfaction. So I would like to ask the consequences, or at least is there an actual consequence into the well-being of the youth in this case, and how you actually act or counteract upon it?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think each of these flourishing domains are interrelated. We have evidence that sort of each affects the others as well. The magnitude of those effects vary. Social relationships and purpose seem to especially strongly affect all the other domains, but the other domains affect each of the others also. So it's a complicated picture over time. But what that means is if there is substantial loss in one domain, and that's not offset by substantial gains in the other, that flourishing can sort of spiral downward. And so, I do think kind of the mental health crisis with young adults explains some also of lower levels of happiness or of a loss of a sense of meaning, or even of financial and material stability. It is more difficult to engage in work when struggling with mental health issues. So I do think some of this has been a downward spiral. I think real struggles over questions of sexual or gender identity, likewise, can be very challenging and can adversely affect mental health and happiness. And so those questions of meaning, of identity, can likewise potentially lead to those negative spirals. And I think another phenomena is the extent of social media engagement in screen time, and that differs dramatically by age. And there's now pretty good evidence, first from very weak cross-sectional studies, then from longitudinal studies over time, and now from randomized trials, that social media engagement, on average, not necessarily for every individual or every use, but on average negatively contributes to well-being. I think that's pretty well studied now, and so that the very substantial higher rates of social media use are likewise lowering well-being, and I think in many cases replacing face-to-face relationships. And so when you suffer there, once again, that kind of negative spiral can be set off. It won't necessarily be set off for every individual, but I think in many cases it has been. And so I think all of those are sort of a part of the explanation, along with what are perceived as declining economic activity. So each of these I think is important. I don't think there's just one phenomenon taking place, but because of that potential for big changes in one aspect of flourishing to adversely affect others, there is potential in certain individuals' lives for sort of a downward spiral, and I think that's happened sufficiently often that we're now seeing these relationships between age and well-being across the flourishing domains where young people aren't doing as well. So I think it's important to kind of look at each of those separately and think about how can we address them.
Hay una ahí, sí, muy bien, perdón, no había visto.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I would like to ask on social elites and economic inequality inside countries. So here you were comparing like developed countries and non-developed countries or underdeveloped countries. But what happens inside, for example, in our case, developed countries? So imagine you have people earning double or triple than others. Like there's big inequality inside even developed society. So is there kind of correlation between how much you earn and the kind of your happiness, your well-being, are you flourishing more, or isn't maybe not that much correlated if you are not in poverty? Imagine you are not in poverty, but is it something that you should aspire to, that you earn like five times more that you are earning now, or it doesn't make much difference? Thank you.
No, good question. And maybe I'll once again take the latter part of the question first. I mean, with regard to economic attainment and its effects on at least happiness and life satisfaction, which has been what has been best studied to date. I think we have less of a sense with some of the other well-being domains. I mean, it is the case that financial security and income do affect happiness. At some level, money can buy happiness, but that effect really begins to taper off. The higher the income, the less of a positive effect it has. And where that change really occurs is going to vary by country and context. Some studies have suggested that roughly $80,000 to $100,000 or euros a year is really, after that, while it's nice to have more money, it doesn't alter happiness all that much. And often the additional income leads people to seek things that don't necessarily contribute to their happiness, or to invest less in relationships. I think there's now some sense that at some point it actually starts decreasing one's happiness, and one needs sort of a much higher income before that happens. I think the best estimates right now are around 300,000 a year before, once you start earning more than that, your happiness actually declines. It's not that it just doesn't contribute much, it actually starts going down. That's pretty difficult to study, but yeah, after a certain point, it doesn't matter all that much. But up until that point, it is a critical factor. So these issues of having the means to sustain flourishing are important. And as we've seen in a number of studies, it's for many people what they consider that they're struggling with the most. So I think these considerations of inequality are important. And I think we can sort of use the same sorts of inequality lenses that have been developed in economics to look at well-being also. And in this global flourishing study, we'll be looking not just at means, but also the extent of inequalities. Some of that work's been done already for happiness, but we have a lot more to do on meaning, on relationships, on character, in terms of sort of the distribution and inequalities. Interestingly, sometimes the results can look quite different and contrary, in fact, to the disparities that one observes for economic or health outcomes. So in the United States, there are pretty notable disparities between black and white populations on income and on health, and we observe those as well. But actually, if you look at meaning or character or relationships, you find in many contexts that the black communities are doing better than the white communities in the United States. And so I think it doesn't in any way mean we shouldn't address the economic or health inequalities, but it also points to the strengths of these communities and towards what we might learn from them as well. So yeah, the dynamics can be quite different across these aspects of flourishing.
Thank you very much for the talk. I wanted to ask about what is the meaning of purpose what it entails, because do we mean like a transcendental purpose that is related to some religious framework, or is it more just like a matter of making sense of your own life in your own terms? Also, and how does this question relates to like the more like pluralistic societies that we live in nowadays?
Yeah, so I think that, in our assessments, at least, we've tried to word the items in a way that they're of interest and accessible to those without religious background or context, that they'd be relevant in a more pluralistic society. I think the sources of meaning and purpose are diverse. I think for many it is religion or spirituality that provides that overarching framework, but for others, a personal life goal or relationships or family. I think there are multiple sources of meaning. Some of the more nuanced work, this kind of extends beyond our crude assessments, also kind of distinguishes between meaning and purpose. Purpose kind of being more goal and end directed, what am I seeking? And meaning really more about understanding the broader context of life. How do I as a person fit into the world? How do my activities fit in? How do I answer the big questions of life? And from what we've seen so far, I actually think the dynamics on meaning and purpose are quite different, both in terms of the effects on health, where purpose tends to dominate, but also what gives rise to meaning in life, which was powerfully shaped, for example, by family relationships. So we have a lot more to learn, but again, I think there are multiple sources of meaning, multiple purposes, and I think trying to understand that is important. I think almost everyone really is seeking purpose and meaning in life, and so I sometimes raise the question in medical, biomedical, or public health settings. Why is it that we know so much more about the determinants of cardiovascular disease than we know about the determinants of what gives rise to meaning and purpose in life? And I'm all for studying cardiovascular disease, but we should be devoting the same level of rigor to trying to understand meaning and purpose and its determinants. This is desired, again, by almost everyone.
Buenas tardes, enhorabuena por la conferencia. Mi pregunta un poco en lo que se trasciende un poco es que parece que la felicidad está muy unida a los trabajos en grupo y sociedades más cohesionadas, ¿no? Yo quería plantear dos efectos de sociedades cohesionadas, ¿no? Una es si realmente al poder le interesa que las sociedades estén cohesionadas porque pueden ser más peticionarias de derechos o de peticiones políticas, y en segundo lugar, unido al consumo, ¿no? Quizás la sociedad, contra más felices, consume menos. Quizás ese dato está analizado, el efecto de la felicidad y el consumo.
Yeah, so, this is not...
Perdón, me refiero si realmente una persona que es más feliz va a consumir menos y por lo tanto al poder no le va a interesar que sea la gente feliz.
Yeah, that's a good question. That one I don't know the answer to, the effect of happiness on consumption. We do know something about the effects of consumption on happiness, but the reverse direction I think is also really quite interesting. Again, I think some level of consumption, some level of having those material necessities is important, and that seems quite clear. But then again, once you get much beyond the necessities, it's really other factors like family, like relationships, like caring for others, like important purposes and pursuits that I think are more powerfully shaping happiness. And one study, not that we did, but a group of colleagues carried out, which I think is quite interesting, was again a randomized trial where people were given money And they were told, depending on whether it was heads or tails when they flipped the coin, they were told either to go buy something for themselves or to go and spend the money in a way that would free up their time. That could be getting help with cleaning or a meal brought in or help with the children, whatever would give you extra time. So buy something for yourself or give yourself some extra time using this money. And the group that bought time, that bought leisure, had higher well-being than the group that bought something for themselves. So again, I think there are kind of limits to what consumption can do in terms of happiness. Some is important, there's no doubt, but after a certain level, it's really investment in those more human things that I think brings happiness. But I'll make a point to study the effect in the opposite direction. How does being happy itself affect consumption? So once we've done that, I will try to get back to you on that. It's a good question.
Sí, muchas gracias por la charla. Bien, en el PowerPoint que ha presentado ha habido un mapamundi donde han aparecido varios países, pero no ha aparecido China. Entonces sí que me gustaría que nos diera una opinión al respecto sobre el florecimiento y sobre sobre la satisfacción que estamos buscando. Gracias.
So in the original design of this global flourishing study with Gallup, we did in fact have China as a part of it. I mean, with a billion people, it seemed important if we wanted to understand well-being globally. Unfortunately, during the course of the pandemic, and I think because of some of the inquiries into the origins of COVID-19, China really started severely restricting data collection by and for foreign entities. And so Gallup was locked out. We really tried to find a way around this, working with kind of Chinese researchers. Would they be able to insert a subset of our questions in a nationally representative sample? We found one who was excited about this and willing to, and they went to their boss who said, absolutely not. And so that was sort of sadly the end of China's participation in this study. We pivoted from China to Australia as a result. But I do think the absence of data on China is a real loss for understanding what's happening with flourishing globally. We've had other challenges as well. The Ukraine and Russia were two of our countries as well. This was prior to the war in Ukraine. And so we've had to abandon data collection in Ukraine. We're still trying to do so in Russia. It's not entirely clear whether that will be possible yet. So while I think this effort's important, we've been met with a lot of challenges, but we do hope eventually to go on and return to China and try to study some of these dynamics there as well. I mean, part of what we're hoping with the Global Flourishing Study is we'll be able to understand what patterns are nearly universal and what ones are really culturally specific. And I think to do that well, knowing something about China really is critical. So we hope to get there, but unfortunately, at least during this first wave of data, we won't have China as a part of it.
Sí, gracias por la exposición. La conciencia o inconsciencia de la persona sobre la realidad de la muerte, ¿qué influencia tiene en la felicidad?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm kind of stretching my mind to think of data or studies that I'm aware of that are relevant to that question. While I'm sure there's some data out there, I'm not sure I know those particular studies. I think the closest I can get, and these studies aren't amongst the most rigorous scientifically, but I think interesting and worthy of further investigation. There was sort of one study that looked at belief in life after death and different mental health outcomes, and found this is cross-sectionally, so everything's measured at the same time. These are the weaker studies that I was talking about earlier. But with one of these weaker studies, it suggested that belief in life after death was associated with better mental health on 5 out of 6 different outcomes. So that's one study. Again, we don't know whether those effects would really carry out in a more rigorous study, but maybe worthy of further investigation. Another study, and this is kind of related to some of the philosophical reasoning and thinking around meaning and purpose, had people think about kind of the vastness of the universe and their smallness, and the fact that their life was going to be of limited duration. And there's some philosophical speculation that that sort of activity, realizing how insignificant you are, would sort of make one feel a sense of meaninglessness or lack of purpose. When the psychologists ran these experiments, they actually found the reverse. That kind of thinking about the vastness of the universe and their own finitude somehow led people towards those activities in life, which they did find meaningful, which they did find worthwhile, and at least temporarily seemed to increase their sense of meaning in life. So again, this was only one study, relatively small, but kind of intriguing, and an area where some of the social science actually maybe challenge some of the more recent speculative philosophical thinking. So I think there's a lot of work to be done still on this question, and maybe bringing philosophy and psychology into greater dialogue. And I'm sure there are other relevant studies out there, and I do think it's an important and worthwhile question, but I'm afraid that's sort of all that comes to mind at the present moment.
Quizá hay más preguntas. Sí, quizá vamos a hacer una última, porque queríamos terminar a 1:30. Estupendo.
Primero, muchísimas gracias por la conferencia. Creo que nos va a servir, ya cuando salgamos de aquí en nuestros domicilios, a hacernos varias preguntas sobre el propósito, y si vamos bien encaminados en que a veces parar un poco. Creo que saliendo de aquí, con lo que nos ha dicho, podemos hacernos preguntas. Y ahí lo de lo que he estado escuchando un poco, tanto a usted como pues a los que han preguntado, lo de vivir en comunidad, la amabilidad, la gratitud y tal, me ha venido un poco a la memoria. Yo tengo, saliendo un poco de religión ni nada, pero sí que es cierto que yo tengo una tía monja de clausura. Lleva 60 años, y yo cuando tenía 20 y tanto, 25 años y tal, no podía entender que con 28 años se metería en como en una cárcel con rejas, que no podrían salir para nada y tal. Pero luego, al cabo de los años, me doy cuenta que viviendo en comunidad como viven, que es una familia, y teniendo lo justo y necesario para vivir, pero que no necesitan mucho más, no necesitan nada más, creo que son muy felices, tienen un propósito en la vida, saliendo un poco de lo que es el tema religioso, que creo que no hace falta lo del consumismo, del dinero. Pues sí, el dinero hace falta porque pues para vivir, pero creo que para lograr una felicidad o tener no son cosas importantes. Y el ejemplo de las monjas de clausura puede haber otros muchos, y son inmensamente felices, y cuando hablas con ellas lo único que irradian es felicidad y paz.
Yeah, I mean, I think the example of nuns or monks, of monasteries or convents are kind of interesting illustrations as to how we intuitively somehow don't always understand the determinants of well-being, of flourishing, of happiness. I mean, you talked about the happiness, the joy of your aunt and of the nuns more generally, and there have been studies on longevity as well that have indicated that those in convents, for example, nuns live very, very long time. And I think your explanations for that are likewise essentially correct. If one goes to those four communal pathways of work, of education, of family, of religious community, I mean, as you said, they're experiencing something of a family life together. They're living in a religious community. They have work, they have a vocation, often one that helps people, which we know from those randomized trials of acts of kindness actually does contribute to their well-being, and in many contexts they have time to study, to continue the education. So in some ways all four are wrapped in together. Again, it's not necessarily everyone's calling or attractive to everyone, but when you return to those institutional communal pathways to flourishing, you can see that those who are called to that sort of life, you can see why, perhaps counterintuitively, many of them really are flourishing. So I think it's sort of a profound example of the humility we need when we approach this topic, that we don't have all the answers, that some aspects of happiness and flourishing can be paradoxical, that we should try to learn from the science and then use that science to promote flourishing for all. So thank you all once again for being here today.
Muchas gracias a todos. Me han llamado moderador al principio, pero no ha hecho falta ninguna moderación aquí porque ha sido muy fácil, vamos, todos muy moderados ya. No, pero muchas gracias, Tyler. Sobre todo quería agradecer a las instituciones, de nuevo, que están detrás de este evento y de los que vienen, los dos que vienen después. El Colegio de Sociología y Politología, el Observatorio de la Realidad Social de Navarra y Comunitas en la Universidad Pública, el ICS, Instituto de Cultura y Sociedad en la Universidad Privada y, por supuesto, las fundaciones, ¿no? La Fundación La Caixa, la Fundación Caja Navarra y espero no dejarme a nadie porque era una lista muy larga. Bueno, pues nos vemos, el próximo es el día 23 para que pues apuntéis. Muchas gracias, Tyler, y un aplauso otra vez.